The icy water struck Hans Muller's face like a slap, jolting him from the half-sleep that had become his only escape from the lice crawling beneath his uniform. Around him in the cramped prisoner transport, dozens of German soldiers huddled in their own filth, the stench of unwashed bodies mixing with diesel fumes and fear. For 3 days they had sailed across the Atlantic, expecting nothing but brutality at journey's end. The Nazi propaganda that had filled their minds painted vivid pictures of American torture chambers, of prisoners worked to death in mines, of humiliation beyond imagination. As the ship's engine slowed and voices shouted orders in English above deck, Hans clutched the small Bible his mother had sewn into his jacket lining, whispering a final prayer. He had survived the hell of Normandy only to face what surely would be a slower, crueler death in enemy hands. But when the cargo doors creaked open and sunlight flooded the hold, what greeted the German prisoners was not the snarling faces of vengeful guards, but something far more unsettling in its ordinariness. American soldiers stood at attention, their uniforms crisp and clean, weapons held casually rather than threateningly. Beyond them, Hans glimpsed a harbor bustling with activity, cranes loading and unloading ships with mechanical precision, workers moving about their casks as if war were merely another day at the office. The contrast struck him immediately. Where German ports had become desperate, bombed-out ruins, this American harbor hummed with abundance and efficiency that seemed almost insulting in its confidence. The march through the processing station revealed layers of shock that Hans's propaganda-trained mind struggled to comprehend. Instead of being stripped and beaten, the prisoners were handed numbered tags and directed through what appeared to be a medical examination. American doctors, speaking broken German and using interpreters, checked for diseases and treated wounds with supplies that seemed limitless. Hans watched in bewilderment as a medic used an entire roll of clean bandages on a single prisoner's infected leg, more medical supplies than his entire Wehrmacht unit had seen in the final months of fighting. The abundance was staggering, almost wasteful in its generosity. When an American sergeant handed him a bar of soap wrapped in paper, Hans stared at the object as if it were made of gold. The soap was white, pristine, and smelled of chemicals he couldn't identify. Nothing like the harsh, gritty bars German soldiers occasionally received when supplies permitted. For months, his unit had shared slivers of soap among dozens of men, and many had gone without washing for weeks at a time. The lice that infested every seam of his uniform had become constant companions, their bites a background irritation he had learned to ignore. Now this enemy soldier was casually handing him an entire bar, as if cleanliness were a right rather than a luxury. The real shock came when they were marched into a long, low building filled with the sound of running water. Hans had expected interrogation rooms or perhaps work assignments, but instead found himself facing rows of shower heads protruding from pipes that ran the length of the ceiling. Steam rose from drains in the floor, and the air was warm and humid in a way that seemed impossible in October. An American guard, speaking through a German-speaking prisoner who had been designated as translator, explained that they were to remove their uniforms and wash thoroughly. The order seemed so preposterous that several prisoners simply stood frozen, convinced this was some elaborate prelude to execution. The fear was not irrational. Hans' Soldaten hätten been told stories of Allied atrocities, of prisoners herded into buildings under the pretense of washing only to be killed in mass. Hans remembered the whispered warnings from officers the Americans had learned such methods from their Soviet allies. As guards began shouting orders and gesturing impatiently, some prisoners began to weep, certain that these would be their final moments. The sound of water hissing through pipes above only reinforced their terror. Surely this was how it would end, not with the honor of battle, but naked and defenseless in an enemy's killing chamber. But what happened next shattered every assumption Hans had carried across the Atlantic. When the first prisoner, pushed forward by impatient guards, stepped under the flowing water, no gas emerged from the pipes. Instead, clean, hot water cascaded over the man's shoulders, washing away months of accumulated grime in seconds. The prisoner's face, rigid with terror moments before, slowly transformed into an expression of pure disbelief. He turned his face upward into the stream, letting the warmth flow over skin that had been caked with mud, blood, and lice since the retreat from France. One by one, the other prisoners overcame their fear and stepped into the flowing water. Hans felt his own terror give way to confusion, then to something approaching wonder. The water was genuinely hot, not lukewarm, not rationed, but abundantly, wastefully hot. It poured from the pipes in endless streams. More hot water in a single shower than Hans had used in months of military service. The soap, when applied to wet skin, produced a rich lather that seemed to dissolve dirt that had become part of his very flesh. For the first time in memory, he felt truly clean. Can you imagine the psychological impact of such a moment? Here were men who had been conditioned to expect torture and death, instead experiencing a luxury that their own army had rarely provided even in peacetime. The contradiction was so profound that many prisoners simply stood motionless under the water, unable to process what was happening to them. Hans watched as hardened veterans, men who had fought across Europe without flinching, began to sob under the streams of hot water, not from pain, but from the overwhelming relief of finally being clean. The abundance on display was staggering in its implications. According to declassified U.S. Army records, prisoner of war camps across America used over 40 million gallons of hot water daily for bathing facilities alone. To put this in perspective, the entire German 6th Army at Stalingrad had access to less water in their final weeks than a single American POW camp used for showers in a single day. The contrast spoke to industrial capabilities that German prisoners were only beginning to comprehend. If America could afford to provide unlimited hot water to its enemies, what resources were available to its own forces? When the shower ended and prisoners were handed thick, clean towels, Hans noticed something that would haunt him for years to come. The towels were discarded after a single use, thrown into bins to be laundered and replaced with fresh ones the next day. In the German army, a single towel might serve an entire squad for weeks, if they were fortunate enough to have one at all. Here, enemy prisoners were being provided with personal towels that would be washed and replaced as a matter of routine. The waste was incomprehensible to men who had been trained to value every scrap of material, every drop of fuel, every grain of food. But the showers were only the beginning of revelations that would fundamentally alter these prisoners' understanding of the war they had been fighting. As they were issued clean prison uniforms and marched to their barracks, each step revealed new layers of American abundance that contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had taught them about their enemy. The barracks themselves were heated, with electric lights that burned all night, a luxury that had disappeared from German cities years earlier as bombing raids targeted power plants and fuel supplies became scarce. The evening meal provided another shock that left prisoners staring at their plates in disbelief. Instead of the thin soup and black bread that had sustained German forces in their final campaigns, American mess halls served portions that seemed almost gluttonous in their generosity. Real meat, white bread, vegetables, milk, and coffee flowed in quantities that exceeded what many German civilians had seen since before the war began. According to nutritional records maintained by the U.S. Army, German prisoners received approximately 3,200 calories per day, more than the official ration for German soldiers in the field, and significantly more than German civilians were receiving under wartime rationing. Hans found himself unable to finish his first American meal, not from lack of appetite, but from sheer overwhelm. The contrast with his final weeks in combat was stark. There, his unit had subsisted on whatever they could scavenge from abandoned villages, often going days with nothing but stale bread and dirty water. Here, behind barbed wire and under guard, he was eating better than he had during the best days of his military service. The irony was not lost on him that captivity had brought abundance, while freedom had meant starvation. The psychological impact of these discoveries rippled through the prisoner population in ways that American guards began to notice within days. Men who had arrived defiant and hostile gradually became quiet and contemplative. Conversations in the barracks took on a different tone as prisoners began to compare their current conditions with their experiences in the German military. Some tried to rationalize the treatment as psychological warfare, designed to soften them for interrogation or forced labor. But as days passed without any demands for information or assignments to dangerous work, even the most skeptical began to acknowledge an uncomfortable truth. The abundance they witnessed daily was not exceptional or temporary. It appeared to be the normal state of American industrial capacity. Trucks arrived at the camp gates each morning loaded with supplies that seemed limitless in their variety and quantity. Fresh bread from bakeries, meat from processing plants, vegetables from farms, all delivered with the routine efficiency of a well-oiled machine. The guards who supervised these deliveries showed no sign of strain or shortage, discussing the supplies as casually as they might talk about the weather. Otto Brenner, a former sergeant from Hamburg, kept a secret diary during his captivity, writing observations in tiny script on scraps of paper he concealed in his bedding. His entries, discovered decades later by historians, provide a window into the mental transformation these prisoners underwent. Day 12, he wrote, "Today they gave us ice cream after lunch. Ice cream to prisoners of war in the middle of a global conflict. I cannot reconcile this with what we were told about American weakness and desperation." If they can manufacture luxuries for their enemies, what abundance supports their armies? Do you believe you could have maintained faith in your cause after witnessing such contradictions? The evidence was becoming impossible to ignore that everything they had been told about American society was not merely wrong, but catastrophically so. The weekly ration of cigarettes provided to prisoners exceeded what German soldiers had received monthly, when they received any at all. The medical care available in the camp infirmary surpassed what many German field hospitals could provide to their own wounded. Even the soap, that simple bar of white soap that had seemed so miraculous on the first day, was replaced regularly, without question or rationing. But perhaps the most profound shock came not from the abundance itself, but from the casual attitude Americans displayed toward it. Guards threw away half-finished cigarettes without thought, left food on their plates that would have sustained German families for days, and treated the camp's resources as if they were inexhaustible. For prisoners who had been conditioned to value every crumb, every thread, every drop of fuel, this apparent waste was almost offensive in its magnitude. Yet it spoke to productive capabilities that dwarfed anything the Reich had achieved, even in its most prosperous years. The realization that began to dawn on Hans and his fellow prisoners was more devastating than any military defeat could have been. They had not simply lost battles or territory. They had been fighting an enemy whose industrial base was so vast that it could afford to treat captive enemies better than Germany could treat its own soldiers. The hot showers and soap were symbols of a deeper truth that Nazi ideology had failed to prepare them for. They had challenged a nation whose wealth and productive capacity exceeded their wildest imagination. Winter brought another series of revelations, as the camp's heating system kept barracks warm while snow fell outside. In Germany, civilians huddled in unheated apartments, burning furniture for warmth as coal became increasingly scarce. Schools and offices closed for lack of fuel, and frostbite claimed more victims than Allied bombing in many regions. Yet here in an American prisoner camp, the heat flowed as freely as the hot water, controlled by thermostats that maintained comfortable temperatures regardless of weather outside. The psychological warfare, if that's what it was, proved more effective than any interrogation technique could have been. Prisoners began to question not just specific policies or military strategies, but the fundamental assumptions that had supported their willingness to fight. If America possessed such abundance that it could lavish comfort on its enemies, what hope had Germany ever had of victory? The questions multiplied with each passing day, each hot shower, each generous meal, each piece of evidence that their understanding of the world had been fundamentally flawed. Hans found himself thinking of his family back in Munich, wondering if they were cold and hungry while he enjoyed heated barracks and 3 meals a day. Letters from home, when they arrived through Red Cross channels, painted pictures of increasing desperation, food shortages, fuel rationing, constant air raids that left civilians sleeping in basements and subway tunnels. The contrast with his own situation became a source of guilt that gnawed at him more persistently than hunger ever had during combat. The soap, that simple bar of white soap, became a symbol that transcended its practical purpose. Each week, when new bars were distributed, Hans held his up to the light, marveling at its uniformity and quality. American factories were producing millions of such bars, not just for their own population, but for prisoners of war, refugees, and allied nations around the world. The logistics alone were staggering. Mines extracting materials, factories processing them into finished products, transportation networks delivering them to thousands of locations across the globe, all while maintaining military production that was simultaneously winning battles on multiple continents. How would you have reacted to such evidence of your enemy's strength? Some prisoners retreated into denial, insisting that what they witnessed was temporary, that American resources would eventually be exhausted by the war's demands. But others, like Hans, began to understand that they had fundamentally misjudged the conflict they had entered. This was not a war between equals, not a struggle that could be won through superior will or fighting spirit. They had challenged an industrial colossus whose production capacity seemed to dwarf the entire German economy. The breaking point for many came during the spring of 1945, as news filtered into the camps about Germany's collapsing position in Europe. Prisoners learned that their homeland was being carved up by advancing armies, while they enjoyed better living conditions than many German civilians. The irony was bitter and inescapable. Surrender had brought comfort, while continued resistance brought only suffering to those they had left behind. The camp's library, stocked with books and magazines in German, provided another window into American abundance. Publications arrived regularly from New York and other American cities, showing advertisements for consumer goods that seemed to belong to a different universe. Automobiles, household appliances, clothing, food products, all advertised with a casual abundance that suggested shortages were unknown in American civilian life. Even accounting for propaganda and advertising exaggeration, the contrast with German conditions was stark enough to shatter remaining illusions about comparative national strength. As summer arrived and hot showers continued without interruption, Hans realized that what he had experienced was not exceptional treatment, but standard procedure. Across America, hundreds of thousands of prisoners were receiving identical care in camps that operated with identical efficiency. The scale of the operation was breathtaking, not just the individual camps, but the entire system that supplied them with food, clothing, medical care, and yes, unlimited hot water and soap. It represented organizational capabilities and resource allocation that the German war machine had never approached. The psychological transformation was complete. Men who had arrived as dedicated soldiers of the Reich gradually became students of American society, observing and learning from the abundance that surrounded them. They began to understand that victory in modern warfare required not just brave soldiers or superior tactics, but industrial foundations that could sustain unlimited consumption of resources. The hot showers they had initially feared as a prelude to execution had become daily reminders of their complete miscalculation of enemy strength. Can you imagine facing such a fundamental reversal of everything you had believed about the world? The soap dissolved more than dirt and lice. It dissolved the ideological certainties that had sustained these men through years of conflict. Each bar represented manufacturing capabilities, distribution networks, and resource allocation that exceeded anything the Reich had achieved in its brief existence. The abundance was not accidental or temporary, but systematic and sustainable, backed by industrial capacity that seemed to grow stronger rather than weaker under wartime demands. When news of Germany's surrender reached the camps in May 1945, many prisoners felt not shock but a kind of relief. The cognitive dissonance between their daily experience of American abundance and reports of German collapse had become too great to sustain. Surrender meant that the killing would stop, that German civilians would no longer suffer for a cause that had clearly been hopeless from the beginning. The hot showers and soap had taught them more about the nature of modern power than any political lecture could have achieved. The months following Germany's defeat brought new revelations as prisoners began to understand the true scope of American industrial might. Production figures released by the U.S. government revealed that American factories had built 16 aircraft carriers, 8 battleships, 24 cruisers, 258 destroyers, and 203 submarines during the war years. Naval construction that exceeded the entire German fleet several times over. Steel production alone reached 89 million tons annually, compared to Germany's wartime peak of 28 million tons. But perhaps the most telling statistic was soap production. American factories manufactured over 2 billion bars of soap annually during the war years, enough to supply not only the civilian population and military forces, but prisoners of war, displaced persons, and allied nations around the world. The simple bar that Hans held each week represented a tiny fraction of production capacity that had supplied the world's largest military while simultaneously maintaining civilian living standards that exceeded German peacetime levels. The repatriation process that began in late 1945 provided one final lesson in American organizational efficiency. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners were processed, given medical examinations, supplied with new clothing, and shipped home in operations that moved with clockwork precision. Ships that had carried invasion forces to Europe now returned with former enemies who had been fed, clothed, and cared for better than their own government had ever managed. The irony was complete. Defeat had brought them abundance, while victory would have brought only continued scarcity. Hans Müller returned to a Munich that bore little resemblance to the city he had left. Rubble filled the streets where buildings had once stood, and his family lived in the basement of their bomb-damaged house, sharing space with 3 other families whose homes had been completely destroyed. His mother, thin and aged beyond her years, marveled at his healthy appearance, unable to understand how captivity had left him better fed and clothed than civilians who had never left home. The soap he brought with him from the camp became a precious gift, divided among family members who had not seen such quality in years. As his sister held the white bar up to the light, examining its perfection with wonder, Hans found himself thinking of the casual abundance he had witnessed daily for over a year. The contrast between American plenty and German scarcity was embodied in that single bar of soap, a symbol of industrial capabilities that had made the war's outcome inevitable from the moment it began. Do you believe such abundance could have remained hidden forever? The truth that Hans and hundreds of thousands of other German prisoners discovered behind barbed wire was too profound to be contained by propaganda or wishful thinking. They had encountered a society whose productive capacity so exceeded their own that it could afford to be generous even to its enemies. The hot showers and soap were symbols of something larger, a system of organization and resource allocation that represented the future of human civilization. In the years that followed, many former prisoners became advocates for the democratic and economic systems they had observed in American camps. Their testimony about conditions in captivity helped reshape German understanding of the war and its aftermath. The abundance they had witnessed became a model for reconstruction, a standard of living to aspire to rather than an enemy achievement to resent. The soap and hot water had washed away more than dirt. They had cleansed these men of illusions about the nature of modern power and prosperity. The story of German prisoners discovering American abundance might seem like a small footnote to the larger drama of World War II, but it reveals fundamental truths about the nature of conflict and civilization in the modern age. The hot showers and soap were weapons more powerful than artillery, tools of psychological warfare that achieved what bullets and bombs could not. They demonstrated that true strength in the 20th century came not from ideology or military tradition, but from the ability to produce and distribute abundance on an unprecedented scale. Today, when we turn on a hot shower or unwrap a bar of soap, we rarely think about the industrial infrastructure that makes such simple luxuries possible. But for the German prisoners who experienced American abundance for the first time in 1944 and 45, these basic amenities revealed the fundamental disparity that had made their defeat inevitable.
They had challenged not just an army or even a nation, but an entire system of organization that could sustain unlimited consumption while simultaneously projecting power across the globe. The lesson remains relevant in our interconnected world, where industrial capacity and resource allocation continue to determine the balance of power between nations and societies. The soap that cleansed German prisoners of their ideological certainties reminds us that abundance itself can be a form of warfare, demonstrating possibilities that make alternative systems seem inadequate by comparison. Sometimes the most powerful weapons are not those that destroy, but those that reveal what human civilization can achieve when properly organized and equipped. Perhaps that is why the story of hot showers and soap in American prison camps continues to resonate decades after the last German prisoner returned home. It speaks to the transformative power of abundance, the way material conditions shape consciousness, and the profound impact of discovering that the world is far different from what we have been taught to believe. In the end, those simple bars of white soap washed away more than dirt and lice. They cleansed an entire generation of the myths that had led them into a war they could never have won. If you found this hidden chapter of history as fascinating as we have, there are countless other untold stories waiting to be discovered in our archives. The secret lives of wartime societies, the unexpected moments of humanity in the darkest conflicts, the small details that reveal larger truths about how ordinary people experienced extraordinary times. Subscribe to join us as we continue exploring these forgotten corners of history, where simple acts of human decency changed hearts and minds more effectively than any propaganda ever could.